Hey everyone. So in this video we want to talk about RBD guides, which side effects introduced in Houdini 18, and this is a really cool way of controlling the behavior of your RBD simulations. Because what it allows you is to take any kind of moving geometry and deform your RBD simulation while still simulating all the stuff like collisions and so on with that geometry. So what I'm showing you here is actually some example videos from side effects from their presentation video of Houdini 18. And here you can see pretty clearly what's going on. So on the left side, you have the control object, and on the right side, the simulation that comes out of it. And as you can see, this allows for some pretty crazy behaviors that you would not naturally get. Now, obviously, that's great for art directing your simulations because you can force in any kind of movement you want. Now, to get this to work, unfortunately, you have to understand a couple of things. It's not as straightforward as it could be. So what I have here is a relatively simple setup. I have a pretty big box representing a building or something and an RBD material fracture to break it up. And then an RBD bullet solver with the default settings. With one exception, under collisions, I activated the ground plane. As you can see with Tommy here on the side, this is a pretty big geometry. And all that happens now if I press start, it will collapse because it's pretty big. I could make the constraints a bit stronger if I wanted, but I lowered them already so that I want them to break apart. So that's the core setup. And now let's control this with a control object. Now, what I already did is I subdivided this geometry so that I can use a bend node to deform the whole thing. And I want to use what we saw in the video. I just want to twist that thing. So let's activate twist. And to position this correctly, I press enter and then B a couple of times. There you go. And now it takes the bounding box and I can animate that thing the way I want. So let's say on the first frame, it looks like this. And I don't know, after 80 frames, it should be rotated like this. There you go. Okay, and this is now supposed to be my control object. And where do I put it in? Well, in the RBD bullet solver, there is actually the last input called guide sim. And here I just put this in, and when I run this, absolutely nothing has changed. And that is because, first of all, we have to activate the function, and that is here under guide. So enable guides. But if I run this now, still nothing happens. And this is where it becomes a little bit annoying. The thing is, in Houdini 19.5, this has changed. Before that, it was enough to just enable the guide. So keep that in mind if you watch tutorials about this function. They actually changed the setup so that you now need a separate node to control the whole thing. And this node is called RBD guide setup. So it's a separate node. Before Houdini 19.5, all of this was built into the RBD bullet solver directly, but now you need this RBD guide setup. And the idea now is that you connect the guide geometry that comes out of it, and then your guide geometry goes up in here. One advantage of this setup is that when you look through the RBD guide setup and run this, you can already see a preview of what is going to happen. And we can already see a problem here. It's not actually twisting, it's just rotating. But we will talk about this in a second. When you use the RBD guide setup, make sure that the start frame and end frame are correct, because those are actually used to analyze the change in your control object. So this has to make sense for your scene. In my case, of course, this starts at 1001. But in your case, it might start at 1 or something, or maybe something different. So make sure that this actually makes sense. And if I run this now, it actually is still not working, even though we even had a preview. And thankfully, it actually tells you what the problem is. It recommends you to pack your geometry. So one more reason to pack your geometry with an assemble, for example. And let's make sure we keep the naming that comes from the RBD material fracture, and we pack the whole thing. And now the RBD guide setup is actually properly working. And now finally we can see that our geometry is moving, at least in roughly the direction of our twist. Now, as a small side note, you can actually circumvent that. If you don't want to use the RBD guide setup, you could still activate the built-in node under advanced guide. And then if you turn off use pre-configured setup, then you have basically an RBD guide setup built into the RBD bullet solver. But I will skip this for now because I think it's actually not too bad that you have a separate node, but just for you to know, you can actually work without the RBD guide setup if you want to, because it is built in the RBD bullet solver still. You just have to activate it by turning off Use Pre-configured Setup. But let's turn it back on because we want to use the RBD guide setup. But as we've seen before with a preview of the RBD guide setup, it's just twisting as a whole. What's going on? That's unfortunately the next thing you have to understand. And that is that the RBD guide system is not actually taking point positions, like a point deform, for example, because then this would work. But it actually expects you to have packed geometry that it can extract the transform information from. What does that mean? It does not mean you can just pack the whole thing. That's not enough. This will not work. But you have to actually split this geometry up into multiple points, or actually multiple objects, pieces that independently move. Thankfully, that's relatively easy because all we have to do is we take, for example, a Voronoi fracture, and we, for example, take a points from volume for this. And let's make sure the amount of points is not that crazy. Something like this is perfectly enough. So now we split this up into multiple boxes. So this is important. Of course, with the Voronoi fracture, those are now separate objects. We can tell with the exploded view, those are separate boxes now. And we bend those boxes, which basically looks like before, but now each box is a separate entity. And now when we look at the RBD guide setup in the preview, we can already see a difference. And that is that it's actually twisting now. And what's happening here is important to understand. Basically, it packs those boxes here, those. And actually, let's look through that afterwards. So it takes those boxes and looks for the closest box it can find, and then tries to apply the same position in space, basically. So it's not taking a deformation of one object, but the transform information of multiple objects. That's very important to understand because this is something you have to put into your setup for it to work. And again, the cool thing now is you can actually see a preview in the RBD guide setup what will happen with your pieces. And here you can see now it moves in the same way. And when we look now through the RBD bullet solver, we can actually finally see the behavior. And the difference to the RBD guide setup preview is that it actually now reacts in terms of collisions. And also at some point, you can see those pieces will disconnect from the whole simulation and just fall off. And this actually happens because under guide there is a release threshold, a linear and an angular and also a distance threshold. And what this basically means is if you mouse over, it explains to you when the distance between the object and the reference box that you can find here, or the reference object, is too high, then it will release the object. And what that means is if the position of the pieces of your actual geometry is too far away of the control box or the control object, then it will release. And the idea here is if it can't basically move further, then it will just stop being controlled by this object. You have to, adjust those numbers to whatever feels right to you, but usually that's what you want, right? At some point, if you rotate a house, then stuff will break off. So this is actually on purpose, and you control this, funnily enough, not in the RBD guide setup, but in the RBD bullet solver directly under guide. So I will not go into this because that depends highly on your case. But what I want to talk about is a problem that you will always see, and that is here, this jittering. This jittering happens basically because our magnet, so to say, our control objects that it tries to follow here, the magnet is basically too strong. And this is something I would recommend definitely lowering up here under blend. Basically what this means is it overrides the velocity of the simulation with the velocity that comes from the magnet, so to say. And this will usually result in a jitter, because it basically is moved away by a collision or something, and then the magnet pushes it back, and then you can see this jitter happening. A good solution for this is simply to lower this to a lower number. In my experience, that's at least 0.5. And you can see now this already solved a lot of the jitter problem. But if there is still some jittering, like you can see here, then sometimes it can make sense even lowering it further, like to 0.25, which basically means the resulting velocity, only a quarter of that will be brought back into the simulation with each frame, which just softens or smooths out the whole behavior. So as you can see now, we got rid of the jittering and the whole thing feels much more smooth. So this is a very important one, and this is why it's pretty up at the top of the whole setup. So lowering the blend is, in my experience, always necessary. So that was a relatively simple example. Let's have a look at a bit more complex cases. And this is actually basically the same, just with a building. Pretty much what side effects try to show you in the videos. So this is pretty slow, even though it's cached to look at this, because it has so much geometry. So let's quickly do a flipbook of that. So here, as you can see, it's basically the same example as before, just with a more complex geometry. The setup, when we look at it, is not any different to what we saw before. In this case, I didn't take the geometry directly because it's too complex. It has also some internal structure and all that. So I just created a boundary box of this. And then with the points from volume, which is keeping the nice grid structure, with a Voronoi fracture, I fracture this into separate boxes. Then I assemble the whole thing, which is not absolutely necessary, as we have seen, but I did it out of a habit. And then a normal bend that again moves the different boxes, not actually deforms a geometry, even though it looks like it. And then applied via the RBD guide setup, which again has this handy function of previewing to you what will happen with your geometry, even though it will not calculate any collisions and stuff like that, but it gives you a good indicator if everything works. And then in the RBD bullet solver, we just saw the pretty heavy simulation. Keep in mind to pack the whole thing, otherwise the RBD guide setup will not work. Here's another example of this that I stole from the presentation. I did the same thing, but this time I grouped the pieces of my control object into two groups. And then with a split, I bended one to one side and the other to the other side. And then I merged them back together. And what we get is this. And the result of this then looks like this. So there you go. My own version of the shamelessly stolen idea from the side effects presentation. By the way, all those examples I will share with you on the right side. So this is why I set this up, so that you have, a clear setup that you can follow if you want to have something similar and to understand the whole workflow better. And then the final example I want to give is, so in the third example, I just want to show you what we did before was, pretty abstract. No building would actually be destroyed like that. But in this case, I wanted to show you that you can even just hand animate pieces like here and group it with a couple of objects, for example. So I took this part of my bridge or this part, and then I just animated them by hand to behave like this. And then the middle part to rotate a bit like this. And the third one at the front to just slide off to the side. So you can also just take pieces of your object and just hand animate it to control how it's supposed to behave, which then in the simulation allows us to really control what kind of destruction is happening. And this is brilliant for really art directing your destruction by just, hand animating the pieces the way you want them to move, including, this nice slide here on the side. And all the collisions and all that stuff will still apply to it. And of course, some pieces, like we said, will break off when they're too far away from their magnet version, basically. Okay, so as you can see, a really powerful tool to really control how your simulations behave. And let's quickly reiterate the most important bits. The first thing is, for this to work, you need a separate node called the RBD guide setup. Make sure that you connect the guide connection here. Then in the RBD bullet solver, you need to activate the guide function. And then what you need is a control object. And unfortunately, it's not enough to just deform any kind of object you want to use. You actually have to split this object up into multiple pieces. There are many ways of doing this, but one I prefer is I use a bound to create the bounding box of the object, then a points from volume to create a grid-like structure, which makes it very easy to understand what's going on. Then, of course, I use a Voronoi fracture to use those points to split the object up into multiple boxes, and that's important. These are now separate objects, and the transforms of these boxes will be used in your RBD guide setup. And the cool thing is, in the RBD guide setup, you get a preview of the whole thing. If you press enter, you can already see if the whole thing worked. Now, unfortunately, that still doesn't work though. And the reason is very important. The RBD guide setup even tells you that you need to pack your geometry. Otherwise, it does not work. So let's use an example here. Make sure we're not overriding the name attribute, but pack the whole thing. And then if we run this, now we can see the behavior in combination with all the collisions and stuff that we have in our simulation. And one last thing is the jittering, and this is usually solved by just making sure that under guides, your blend value of the velocities is something between 0.25 and 0.5. And of course, this is an amazing tool to art direct your simulation to any kind of behavior you want. I hope this is helpful. So thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.